Thank you. Thank you all very much for being here. Let's get started. A special shout out to Anna and Esther today. So we are transmitting live from the CRV, originally room 8 something or other, where the evil spirits have taken control of the AV. And so we have at the last moment moved here to the 10th floor. And that's involved a fair amount of moving of electrons and other things. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, Anna and Esther. And thank you, Dr. Moskovitz. Our distinguished visiting speaker has been helping move sandwiches and find scotch tape to put on the door and notice saying we've changed the venue. Pardon me. Cary's director of writing studies, and the full name of the program actually.
Writing the disciplines in the Thompson Writing Program.
Thompson Writing Program, writing in the disciplines, which I think, captures, pardon, which captures some of the latest thinking, as I think perhaps Dr. Johnson may remind us later, about how writing studies have evolved in the curriculum and what they're really good for. Dr. Moskovitz has been doing that and doing it for a very long time. He has this lovely NSF, or National Science Foundation grant, to study challenges related to text recycling. He's been a visitor before. It's a privilege to have him back. And he's going to be sharing some of what he's learned about what I think is one of the most interesting challenges we face when it comes to documenting our work in the academy. With that, Cary, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kev. Thank you for having me back. Trying to figure out camera position wise, what's the best way for me to be facing? Guess it's kind of a wash here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, pardon me if my back to you, and let me know if you can't hear me. Got it. Thank you. That's me. That's you. I do want to recognize NSF that supported the work that I'm going to be presenting here through a grant from their Ethical and Responsible Research Program, and also collaborators whose material is included in this talk. I'll give you just a quick second to look at that. So to start, we need to talk about what we're talking about here. What is text recycling? Here is what I consider to be a pretty archetypal example. So the first passage at the top here is from a publication in Science in 2010. The one below from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012. So both among the top general science journals in the world. And you can see that these two passages are identical except for the two trivial differences. The top one gives the sample size, the bottom one includes the words or not. So this kind of thing, if you're in the sciences, you know, happens all the time. You're doing another study and there's some things that are the same as the last study that you've done. And that raises both ethical and legal questions regarding that reuse. Also, this example is a nice one that shows another common but really under-discussed issue of text recycling, and that is authorship. So these two papers both had the same first author. Each had around 6 or 7 authors, but the authorship of the two papers was not identical. So there were some authors on the first paper who were not actually included in the second when their material was reused. In addition to this kind of reuse, which is from one scientific article to another article, there are other kinds of recycling as well, from a grant proposal or an IRB protocol to an article, from a poster presented at a conference to an article, from an article to a dissertation, from an article to a book chapter. So researchers recycle materials in lots of different ways and contexts, which makes it challenging to try to figure out and communicate best practices. A quick note then on terminology. So up until around 2013 or 2015, when this topic was discussed at all, which was rare, it was referred to as self-plagiarism. And that terminology now has largely gone out of favor with those of us who are studying it or involved in editorial or publication ethics. And instead, we prefer the term text recycling. And the main reason is, as I just mentioned, there are some kinds of reuse that are completely legitimate and legal, and in some cases widely accepted, in other cases where it's inherently problematic, unethical, or illegal. And using the term self-plagiarism becomes confusing because what policies or editors end up doing is telling authors that sometimes it's okay to self-plagiarize. And obviously that's a pretty strange thing to do if you're calling it plagiarism and then say it's okay sometimes and not other times. So text recycling is an ethically and legally neutral term, and then we can then talk about when it would be appropriate or inappropriate. So this is our definition from the Text Recycling Research Project of text recycling. So briefly, text recycling is the reuse of any textual material that might be words, prose, visuals, or equations in a new document where these three things occur. First, the material in the new document is identical to that of the source or substantively equivalent in both form and content. And that's important because oftentimes when material is recycled between one document and another, there are changes made to adapt it to the new situation. Or for instance, there might be a consistent method of, let's say, getting a sample for a study, and it's used in a subsequent paper, the methodology, but obviously the sample in the new paper is different, so there'll be small changes there. We would consider that to be text recycling nonetheless. And then number two, that the material is not in the new document as a quotation. So basically, if it's in a document and there's quotation marks around it, it's a quotation, it's not recycling. And then you would follow whatever standard protocols in your discipline would be for referencing quotations. And then finally, at least one author of the new document is also an author of the prior document. I'll come back to authorship in a little while, but I think that you all can recognize the issue here that in the sciences, and certainly in the medical sciences, it's very rare to have a single author document. It's also very rare that you actually have subsequent publications coming out of the same research team that all have the exact same authors. Matter of fact, we did a study on that, and we found out from within the NSF, from our corpus of work, from one paper to another in the same grant that we sampled, only about 7% had identical authorship. So if you limit your definition in this context to only situations in which the authors are exactly the same, you get nothing useful for about anybody. So I'm going to shift now to the ethics and practical issues of text recycling. Oops. So here's a quote from an editorial in the Journal of American Association of Nurse Practitioners. Recycling is good for trash, but unacceptable for scientific literature. So if authors are trying to figure out what's appropriate practice, really depending on where you look, and it's utterly random whether you find somebody saying you should never recycle anything. This is from a 2016 editorial. On the other hand, if you go to the Committee on Public Ethics, which is one of the leading professional societies for public ethics, what you see there is this. In research articles, if we're talking about the introduction or the background, some degree of text recycling in the background, the introduction section of an article may be unavoidable. And it goes on to say, duplication of background ideas may be considered less significant or even considered desirable. And then where they describe recycling and methods, Cope says, the use of similar identical phrases in method sections when there are limited ways to describe a method is not unusual, and looking at the blue passage, may actually be of value when a technique that is common to a number of papers is described. That is, from a reader's point of view, there can be real benefits to keeping explanations of some things, methodology, et cetera, consistent, rather than changing it just to make it different to avoid charges of self-plagiarism. So, one of the things that oftentimes comes up in discussions and policymaking for text recycling is, because it's complicated and contentious, why not just avoid it altogether and do something else? So one of the possibilities is just summarize the thing that you want to reuse. For instance, the explanation of the statistical procedure or injection methods or whatever it is. briefly summarize it and refer readers to the prior paper that was the source for that material. There are definitely situations in when that's appropriate, and authors oftentimes do that. However, there's also many times in which editors do not want readers to have to go to another publication in order to read the publication in hand, especially given that that other publication may be behind a paywall and then make it difficult for readers to actually know what's going on. So why not just quote the material instead? And this is actually a guideline that we found when we were surveying policies among publishers, journals, and professional societies. Oftentimes we would see, if you want to reuse something, even if it's your own, just put in quotation marks and treat it like you would treat any other quotation. The American Chemical Society, for instance, in their journals, they oftentimes have this advice. Well, here's why not. Here's a paper from a psychology journal. The text has been edited to maintain the privacy of the authors, but all of the gray parts that are shaded there are recycled. So you can see in the introduction, there are some places where you have a number of sentences, other places some phrases. You can go under, look under the methods, and you can see similar things there. Couple of, obviously there's some scattered words which are irrelevant, but places where you might have 3 or 4 sentences in a row, and then something else, and then a sentence which has been edited to make it fit the new context. If you were going to put that material in quotes, this, for instance, these 2 pages would have something like 20 or 30 pairs of quotations. No scientific editor is going to accept that in their paper, right? So the idea of saying, just quote it instead of citing it, really advice given on the incorrect assumption that when researchers recycle material, they do so in just 1 or 2 contiguous blocks of text. So the other option is reword it. We found from our studies, we did both survey studies of editors across disciplines and then in-depth interview studies. We found that oftentimes editors were afraid of either ethical policy violations or copyright infringement, but would actually tell authors, Authenticate has flagged this much material. You should just rewrite it. With the idea being, you can avoid the problem by just making it different enough. So here's, for instance, from a managing editor of a medical journal. I've been authenticating all revised paper for several years now, and I'm continually frustrated by self-plagiarism. You'd think that researchers, authors with MDs and PhDs would be bright enough to know how to reword, right? So this editor thought that the reason that they're not doing it or don't want to do it has to do somehow with their ability or capability of paraphrasing themselves. On the other hand, here's a quote from a researcher in astrophysics. I just spent 2 tedious hours trying to reword the most boring chunks of my paper because I got pulled up on self-plagiarism, right? So basically, that's the outcome of the just reword it option. Here is what it looks like in practice when people reword things just to make them different, but not because there's any substantive reason to do so. So these are 3 passages from papers from the STSS partnership developing a malaria vaccine, and 2 papers from the New England Journal of Medicine, 2011-2012, the bottom one from PLOS Medicine. And you can see here that all these passages are doing basically the same work, but the clauses have been moved around, right? So in the first case, during 12 months of follow-up starts the sentence. In the next case, it ends the sentence. So there's just this rearranging of clauses and coming up with synonyms, basically to keep the software, the plagiarism detection software, from recognizing the materials being reused, when in fact, just reusing the one version would be much more straightforward, easier for readers, and actually not causing any real ethical problems. So it's a kind of invented problem by people who are acting in a risk-averse way.
It's almost helpful use color coding text that I've seen.
Thank you.
It's
So,
beautiful.
thank you. And here is how silly it can get. So again, these are from these 3 same papers. All of them had this sentence, clinical malaria was defined as, right? So of course, if you're doing a study on malaria vaccine, you need to say exactly what a case of malaria is going to be. One version used the greater than sign and then 5,000 parasites per cubic milliliter writing cubed. The next one added density of more than, writing out per cubic milliliter. And the last one changed per cubic milliliter to its mathematical equivalent microliters, right? For what? I can't believe that there was anything going on here other than some sense that the authors felt they needed to change it, or were told by editors who got it flagged, you need to make it different. So these have been the issues that we've been working hard in the text recycling research project to really push back against. Some unfounded assumptions about both ethics and best practices. And one of the reasons why these kind of ideas have tended to circulate is there's been no central place that editors or authors could go to find out what would be considered acceptable practice. So we're increasingly managed to making our project, the text recycling research project, that place. So one of the things we've worked on is what's turned out to be a rather thorny problem of terminology. If you don't have good, stable, well understood, and consistent terms, it becomes very difficult for either policymakers or other stakeholders, editors or authors, to know what's going on in this journal, what's going on in this journal. Are these policies the same? Are they different? So here are 4 terms that are most frequently used in any discussion of reuse of one's own material: text recycling, self-plagiarism, redundant publication, and duplicate publication. And here's the problems that show up. The Council of Scientific Editors, for instance, says plagiarism generally involves the use of material from others, etc. And then you can see at the end, this is sometimes called self-plagiarism or duplicate publication. So the Council of Scientific Editors uses these 2 terms synonymously. There we go. The Committee on Publication Ethics says text recycling, also known as self-plagiarism. So Cope uses text recycling and self-plagiarism as synonyms, and then goes on to say a separate issue not to be confused with text recycling is redundant or duplicate publication. They use those terms as synonyms, whereas, as I showed you before, these things were mixed. Springer Nature and Taylor Francis. So these are 2 of the leading for-profit publishers in the field, and they have a different way of using it. They call redundant publication basically the umbrella term. Within that is self-plagiarism, and text recycling is a subset of self-plagiarism. Taylor and Francis, you can see here, uses text recycling and self-plagiarism as identical terms or equivalent terms, and then within that is a subset. So basically you can see, depending on whether you go to the Committee on Publication Ethics or a specific publisher or a specific professional society, you'll find people using these terms in different ways, in ways that oftentimes are directly in contradiction to what appropriate policy would then imply. Sorry, here we go. So this is our terminology that we've developed to try to come up with a set of useful terms that align with generally the ethics and legality of the practices. So I'll just walk you through these quickly. So developmental recycling is basically reusing materials that aren't published in making a new thing. So that might include reusing material from a grant proposal to an article, or for a conference poster to an article, etc. So if the source material is not published, we call it developmental recycling. It's usually ethical and usually legal. The one real restriction on the legality being, if those materials were done with a work for hire agreement, where your employer owns your intellectual property, you would need to get permission there. Then, if we move on and we say, yes, the source material is published, but are you reusing the major ideas or content from that paper? If not, then we call that generative recycling. And whether it's ethical or legal depends on the specifics. How much material you're reusing, whether it's, let's say, methods material versus results, what the copyright laws are in the country, and what the contract of assignment. Adaptive publication is basically reusing the heart of the piece of the material, but adjusting it for a different audience or a different genre. So that might be reusing something, for instance, from a published article in a commentary opinion piece, or a translation of an article into another language. That can be ethical and legal. It really depends on two things. First of all, the original source material was only almost certainly copyrighted, and that copyright transferred. So if you wanted to, for instance, republish a piece and submit it in a different language, you would first need to get permission from the original publisher, and then be clear with the author and the editors, with the editors of the new publication that it's already been published, and make sure that they're willing to republish it. And second, be transparent with readers by including clear notes in the piece that the piece had been previously published with a different title and a different language. And then finally, there's duplicate publication, which is really trying to get an extra publication out, either resubmitting the same piece to a different journal as it is, or making trivial changes and resubmitting it. It's rarely going to be ethical or legal. One of our studies was doing interviews with journal editors across STEM, humanities, and social science fields. And these were in-depth interviews, and I'm just going to very quickly just give you a top-level sense of what our findings were here. So one was, and maybe the driving issue, originality. When people were recycling material from one published paper to another, a central issue was, is the new paper original? The interesting thing was, a number of editors said a piece is original if it's making a new intellectual contribution, and it didn't matter if there were some pieces of a prior paper reused, description of methods, part of a literature review, etc. It was still an original contribution. And other editors said it's only original if every piece of it has never been published before. Then they talked about rewriting text, or rewording issues we've talked about already. Also, question of what counts as prior publication. So there would oftentimes be stipulations that they wouldn't publish something that's already been published. And if some of that material was, for instance, in a blog post and discussed for a more broad public audience, for some editors, that didn't matter. For others, they would say it's already been published, it's already out there, we're not going to publish it. And then there were copyright concerns. And one thing that we found was editors oftentimes made decisions about what's acceptable for text recycling based on concerns about copyright infringement, but they rarely had actually an accurate understanding of what those laws were, because those laws are actually complicated and there's no clear place you can go. That is, there's no explicit laws that say anything about the reuse of scholarly work itself, and there's no prior case history. Nobody's ever brought a lawsuit about it. So we really have to do some pretty complex interpretation to figure out what that is. My team has done some of that work. And what we found out, we've written a white paper on this, is that at least within the United States, the most common kinds of recycling that are done from one research paper to another are actually legal under fair use. That is, when we look at to see when people are doing another paper in the same general area, what kinds of things and how much material they reuse it, that would all be considered to fall within the fair use provision, because the new piece is substantively distinct from the prior piece, and they're not using more than they would need to. And then there were issues of beliefs versus practices. That is, there were editors who said they think that reusing text in certain ways is ethically fine and probably makes sense, but they would caution their trainees against doing it for basically risk mitigation. They was like, well, we don't know, you could get in trouble, therefore you should probably avoid it, really perpetuating that kind of issue. So a brief note on legality. As I mentioned, it's a complicated issue. Copyright laws. So first of all, copyright laws vary substantially across countries. As I mentioned, the US, we have fair use. Other countries generally don't have a fair use provision. Some have something that's somewhat similar to it. And of course, we have complications because so much of the work that's done in the sciences and certainly in the medical sciences involves international collaborations. So for instance, the development of this malaria vaccine involved people in the United States, people in Europe, people on the ground in Africa who were actually doing the clinical trials, whose copyright laws apply. These are almost impossible things for authors, even editors, to understand and be able to predict. Briefly, contract law is the other thing which rarely gets discussed. We've looked at a lot of publishing contracts through the lens of text reuse. And what we found is a lot of publishers have explicit statements that say authors may reuse some amounts of material in some context. Oftentimes, those are fairly generous. Oftentimes, they're rather restrictive. And authors oftentimes don't look to see if I've actually signed a contract that in any way gives me additional rights or restrict my rights. And the nature of contract law is basically that it trumps copyright law. So that is, if your contract says you can reuse up to half of your paper that you publish with us in a future paper, it doesn't matter what the contract laws of the country are. You've already got that agreement with the organization that owns the rights. Similarly, if the contract says you can't reuse anything and you sign that contract, even if, for instance, a fair use provision in the United States would have allowed it, you've signed away that right. It's also possible to amend contracts when you sign them, and this is one of the things that might be reasonable to do. One quick note here. The Text Recycling Research Project has been working to try to address this really messy legal situation, which is pretty untenable because hardly anybody can know what's legal or not, and to try to clarify it. And we have an opinion piece that's clearly under review. I'm hoping it'll be coming out soon, that makes an argument to publishers about why and how they could change their contracts to make the kind of recycling that's actually very common in the sciences explicitly legal. To have the contract say you can recycle material within a reasonable amount as long as you're following the ethical guidelines we've got. And the idea is put the decisions in the realm of ethics and professional norms where we think they belong, rather than having some untenable legal barriers. So I want to just give you a quick sense of the kind of messiness in reality of the standards of things, particularly in the health sciences around text recycling. So here are two major publishers of nursing scholarship, Wiley and Elsevier. They publish these journals, among others. And we might think about two things. Recycling from the previously published article into that journal. What are the restrictions and what the allowances? Or recycling from articles in that journal to some future article. So for the first part, which we call incoming text recycling, we're looking to see what a publisher would be allowed to include it in a manuscript submitted to one of its journals. And here the publisher has two concerns. Legal, that the publications are not infringing copyright, and ethical, that the publications don't violate ethical norms of reuse. So if you, for instance, were submitting to the Journal of Advanced Nursing, which is published by Wiley, we could go look at their publication ethics document. That's what you find if you go looking for it online. And it says, this journal is a member of the Committee on Publication Ethics. So you'd think then their policies would be equivalent to Cope's policies. And then they say, basically, read Wiley's 10 publishing ethics tips for authors here, and then Wiley's publication ethics guidelines can be found there. And so you might say, okay, I want to make sure I'm following these guidelines. Let me go read those things. And what you find is the Wiley guidelines then direct you to yet another organization, including the Council for Scientific Editors, which you can see here, where it incorporates a definition of duplicate or redundant publication in its white paper. And if we go look at that white paper, it says authors must avoid duplicate publication, which is reproducing verbatim content from other publications. So if you actually follow the line of links and suggestions they give you, you end up finding something which is actually directly contrary to what the Committee on Publication Ethics says, for which this journal is a member. Okay, so I'm going to skip the other example here briefly for time, so we have more time to talk about it. But we see basically similar concerns if we go through Elsevier, and I'm going to just roll on through here, just down to an example. So if we go to look at what you're allowed to do in a future publication, here's from Wiley's contract. So Wiley's contract says, if you look at the highlighted part B down here, reuse in other publications. The right to reuse the final published version or parts thereof for any publication authored or edited by the contributor, excluding journal articles, where such reused material constitutes less than half the total material of publication. In any case, any modification must be accurately noted, right? So the Wiley contract says, basically, you can reuse up to half of your material in some future publication. Could be a textbook, a commentary, just not a journal article. And if you go look to see what they say then basically you can use smaller amounts in journal articles. So you can probably get the sense here that basically it's really difficult to just kind of follow a reasonable line of inquiry to find out what you should do or not. Here you also see in the Wiley contract, it says, for article abstracts, figures, tables, artwork, selected text up to 250 words, contributors, that is authors, may reuse these things as long as they give full credit, etc. So what they tell you is in your contract, you can reuse up to 250 words in your next publication. And oddly, you can reuse any amounts of the artwork. So you could reproduce tables and figures and diagrams without limit, and only relatively small number of words, which is pretty bizarre because in the sciences, right, it's usually the meat, the heart of the work is in the figures and tables and where the data is presented. Let's go through this example, more complications. So what I'm going to walk you through now for the next 5 minutes or so are the best practices for researchers that were developed by the Text Recycling Research Project. And let me just say here, the TRP, we have an advisory board with about a dozen members who represent expertise across the realm of publishing and publication ethics. So that includes people like the chair of COPE, the chair of the Council of Scientific Editors, those editors that are in charge of publication ethics for 2 of the major publishers, including Springer Nature, MIT Press, and things like that. And all our documents have been substantially vetted by this group, gone through multiple iterations, because we want to do is end up with guidelines that most people can feel are going to be reasonable and accepted by the relevant communities. So, first of all, text recycling may be ethical or unethical, desirable or undesirable, depending on the context, the nature, the quality of recycled material. So that's the most important thing to understand first. It is neither completely unethical or illegal, nor always acceptable. So how to recycle ethically? First, authors should recycle text where consistency of language is needed for accurate communication. And we ended up making this our first point because there's so much risk aversion at work in the decisions of publishers and authors that unless we say, if it would be more clear to keep the language the same, you should do it, it's really easy for the communities to fall back and like, let's just not get into that mess. Second, authors may recycle text as long as the recycled material is accurate and appropriate for the new work and does not infringe copyright or violate publisher policies. 3, authors should be careful not to recycle text in ways that might mislead readers or editors about the novelty of the new work. So this is really the fundamental ethical concern here. If you're trying to disguise something to get an extra publication out for your CV or your promotion, that's not appropriate practice. Then legally, for most unpublished work, authors automatically hold copyright and they can recycle from that without legal restriction. Again, the one caveat being work for hire arrangements. Most publishers require authors to transfer copyright to the publisher, in which case the authors no longer own the rights to that piece. I've read many statements and looked at discussion boards and blogs where experienced scientists are saying, of course I can reuse it, I wrote it. But the reality is, for the vast majority of publications in the sciences, you sign away your copyrights when you agree to publish it. One of the few kind of generally available exceptions is the PLOS journals. PLOS use the Creative Commons license. As I said, some contracts may explicitly give you some rights to recycle. Here's what I think is the other, maybe most important thing here. There's obviously going to be many cases in which the author or editor are unclear on whether a certain amount of recycling or kind in a paper is going to infringe copyright or contracts or not, right? Because those things are hard to know. Generally, what's happened in the past is editors have said, boy, if we're not sure, let's just play it safe and do that rewriting thing where you just scramble stuff around. But the reality is, we have a standard protocol for reusing stuff, which people use for visual materials, photographs, diagrams all the time, which is just to go to the prior publisher and ask permission. So what we basically say is, if you're concerned about it, just get permission like you would for a visual, and they're almost certainly going to give you permission to reuse a few paragraphs of your own work. Then, transparency, which is the key to the ethics here. Authors should be transparent with editors, informing them about the presence of recycled material upon submission. That's not after it gets flagged by Authenticate, but basically if you're saying, we have a standard way of writing up this protocol for our lab. Here's what it is. We've used it before. Here's a citation. And you might also say, we've reused these other things, this from a grant proposal or this from a talk we gave. Just be clear with the editors up front, and then you basically no longer have ethical issues. You just have to have negotiations about what's going to be acceptable for that journal. Authors should be transparent with readers by including a statement that notifies readers that the document contains recycled material. And I'll just make a note here that we're seeing this now that the text recycling research projects materials are being substantially circulated, that we've seen, for instance, both in, for instance, Science Advances and a British medical journal articles where the authors are saying, for instance, in the methods section, we note here that we have recycled material from this section of the paper from this prior paper with a reference to it according to text recycling project best practices. And then readers know when they see it, that's what's going on. Nobody feels duped. I'll also, let me just finish this slide. And so finally, sorry, my way, clicking on that. Authorship. So authorship is actually one of the most thorny problems with text recycling in the sciences, because as I mentioned before, there's two conditions that are just almost always true. One is there's going to be multiple authors, and two is the subsequent paper won't have exactly the same authors as the prior paper did. After a lot of thinking about this and discussing this with research ethics folks, publishers, we decided that the best reasonable approach is to say that the corresponding author of the new work should obtain permission from the prior authors who were not included on the new paper whenever it's reasonable to do so. So if there's situations where there's 2 or 3 authors who were authors on the prior work, to get permission from those, it would be a pretty easy thing to do and almost always granted. If, on the other hand, it's a situation like the SDSS partnership papers where you have 100 authors on each paper, it becomes just untenable. And so in that case, probably the best we could do is ask permission of the PI and the lead author if the lead author is different, at least so they're in the loop and people, again, just aren't having their work appropriated. I'll also just add a note here that just in November, PNAS, which is one of the leading scientific journals on the planet, the Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences, just added to their author guidelines that authors should refer to the text recycling research project's best practices for text recycling. So we were really glad to see that. There have been a number of lower level journals who have done that, but that's the first really kind of high level journal. So we're hoping that this is going to take, and in another 3 to 5 years, maybe authors won't have all this conundrum of trying to figure out this messy world of every journal or publisher having their own guidelines and be able to have that standardized.
To make sure I understand that.
Sure.
So congratulations seem to be in order. Your project has led to PNAS saying what you guys have come up with is our
It's going
standard.
to be their standard, right?
Well done.
Yeah, thank you. Also, another similarly, just, and I'm not saying this to brag on a project, although it's of course nice to be nice. It's nice to be successval. Anesthesiology, which is, I don't know, the or one of the leading journals in that field, last year, a year and a half ago, rewrote their author guidelines to make text recycling in methods section explicitly allowable where it wasn't before, when they went back and reworked theirs, and again referenced our work, which was great. Okay, so our recommendations on authors' rights. Basically, like Elsevier, we saw gives authors broad rights to recycle. Wiley's were more limited and confusing. If it's okay for Wiley to do it in all their publications, then I think we can say there's no fundamental ethical problems here, right? It's just folks having their own predilections and trying to find kind of what they think is right in a mess. So why shouldn't all journals? So we advocate for publishers giving authors explicit legal rights to recycle as long as they follow the best practices. So do it appropriately and make it legal. And then also, publishers should explicitly state that they won't pursue legal action against authors if they follow best practices. One of the interesting things I learned on the legal side when I was presenting at the Council for Scientific Editors meeting a few years ago, and one of the legal copyright lawyers was there, said, in fact, text recycling is so common and has been so common for so long in the sciences that any major publisher would have among its publications many, many instances of having recycled something. So it's almost unthinkable that a major publisher would bring a lawsuit against an author or another publisher with recycling, because they will have many cases of where they have done it themselves. So the reality is no one's going to be sued for this, and editors just need to really understand that and stop acting from that risk-averse point of view. Okay. So just quickly before I wrap up here, here are some documents that are now available that were produced by the Text Recycling Research Project, and again, vetted thoroughly by our advisory board. We have best practices for researchers. We have an Understanding Text Recycling, a guide for researchers that more elaborated, gets into the issues behind the best practices, a similar one for editors, a white paper on copyright law in the US, and a model text recycling policy that was just released. Our commentary announcing that piece was jointly published in the Council for Scientific Editors and its European equivalent last fall. All right, now we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Super, thank you so much. Folks in the room, folks online. Questions for Dr. Moskovitz? While they are framing a question, I'll ask one. I'm in the whole domain of scientific publication authorship has shifted a lot over half centuries over the years, because we have completely commodified, if not fetishized, the scientific publication. It's how you get grants, it's how you get promoted, it's how, I mean, you'll appreciate it not introduce you by saying how many articles you published, right? So it's almost like the way books used to, universities would say how great they were by counting the number of books in the library. But we've also learned that it's actually really easy to get articles published, especially when you've got a lot of authors.
And 10,000 journals.
And 10,000 journals, right? How much of this is, well, one is self-inflicted, and two, is there any sense in which the need for text recycling bumped so close against redundant publication that I mean, that distinction you drew is really important. But after a point, surely if I have to recycle that much, what am I saying that's new here?
Right. And so a couple of things that I think worth noting. One is that really the distinction between redundant publication, or what we call duplicate publication, and other kinds of text recycling is really the attempt to take the core ideas and just reuse them to get another publication out, right? In which case there isn't anything substantively new, or it's a really small piece of something, right? That's different than the kind of recycling that researchers regularly do and need to do, which is there are bits and pieces of things we've said before, right? Okay, so that distinction I think is really important. But the publication pressures that lead to either excessive text recycling, to where it becomes either legally or ethically problematic, or into redundant publication, a lot of those pressures are worse in other countries. We've learned, for instance, in Europe, it's much more common for faculty to just make minor changes to something and republish it, and it's almost ignored among the RPT people just because having the list of stuff is just counting is so important. More problematic is in China and in India to a large extent, where researchers who operate in places where English is not the dominant language need to publish in English in order to get promoted, or sometimes even to get their degrees. And in those cases, you have people oftentimes reusing stuff, for instance, might be from their lab group, making some minor changes. Their grasp of the language is not as good. So they have this pseudo-ethical idea that, well, it was so well written the first time, right? And so, and now oftentimes this leads to a lot of cases of plagiarism where people are just taking large chunks of stuff that they couldn't have written themselves and reusing. But definitely those pressures are both problematic, but ultimately really so undesirable, because so much of what ends up getting published is so meaningless anyway.
Well, that's just that. What's a significant contribution that defends the recycling without it constituting redundant publication? And the answer is, what you're suggesting is, it's getting harder and harder to push to find out what's really important and new and innovative because of the pressures to get stuff out there.
Right. And also with the growth of online publishing, right, where you can have a journal and not need to have the infrastructure of actually being able to print something, right? We have all these burgeoning journals, which basically means the market for publication increases with the demand for the need for publication, rather than it being a gatekeeper operation where we're only going to publish the stuff that's worth money. Other questions?
I had a quick question. In the work that your group has put out regarding, where should the acknowledgement of text recycling go? You mentioned the body of an article that they mentioned text recycling was used here. Or do you guys recommend that it should go like at the end of an article, say for example, like how you'd have author contributions, listed like this, could you put text recycling there with reference? And what are the pros and cons of doing either of that?
That's a great question. So just so people make sure you're here, the question is, if you're trying to be transparent with readers in an article and let them know material's been recycling and has been recycled, where do we recommend you put those notices? And actually, in an early draft of our best practices, we drew up what we were going to have as our guidelines for how and where to do that. And when we discussed it with our advisory board, we realized there's going to be too many differences among publishers about the structure of their work and also kind of their templates, that it wasn't worth us trying to push for a particular format or technological solution versus to say, you should be clear and notify it, and then let the editors or their publishers tell you what their policies would be in order to do that. Now, those things are rapidly evolving. So my guess is many editors would be open to suggestions. And our sense is do it in the way that's going to be the most visible and apparent to readers. So for instance, if you're only recycling material in the method section, it's probably a good idea to put that note towards the beginning of the method section. That's where it's applicable. If there's other stuff there, it might be in a footnote. We also suggest that if there's no other good way to do it, down at the bottom of an article where you would have acknowledges and statements of funding, you could put there a statement on text recycling that says material has been recycled, and put the citations for the recycled material there. The reason why, everything else being equal, I think it's better to put those citations for recycling in a note rather than the reference list is, if the paper was important as prior literature, you would be citing it in the reference list anyway, and it would be discussed. But just because it's the reference list, readers don't know that anything's been recycled from it. They just know it's a reference for the paper, right? On the other hand, there's been a concern that of excessive self-citation. And if you add to your references papers that you're only recycling material from, does that boost your citations? And so that's a way of getting out of that problem. But right now, I think we're at a state where just being explicit with readers that material has been recycled somewhere in the paper would be a major step forward from what is normally done, which is nobody knows and nobody talks about it.
Thank you. This has been such an eye-opening talk, so thank you.
Thank you. We have time for another question?
We do have time for one more question.
Anything else?
Shout out to our colleagues Valerie and Joanna, by the way, electronically present from across the Great Water, by which we mean the Miami River. Last question then, if anybody, Dave?
I'll take a question.
Okay.
Do you have any examples? Have you seen authors challenge publishers before signing a contract?
Yes, and matter of fact, it's become increasingly common in research centers and certainly in academics to have support for authors to negotiate contracts. So David Hansen, who is now director of Authors Alliance, has been with our project since the beginning, was former the director of copyright for Duke University Libraries. And he worked with those policies and oversaw a lot of that work, where as an author, you could go to this resource center and say, I've got this contract, here's what it says, I'd like to push back on this, how do I do it? And actually, it's pretty common that authors can be successful when they do that. But usually the case is authors have no idea that they don't just have to just sign it as it is.
Yeah, I think normally we see these things and we say,
Who cares, whatever, you can accept my
what's the
paper.
alternative?
That-
What is anybody going to take this seriously?
That's right. That's right. So it is actually possible. And Authors Alliance that David now is directing is an organization that works to do just things like that, to help empower authors against basically, the hegemony of the for-profit publishing industry, which basically is getting their work for free.
That's another condition.
Yes.
On the way out, would be interesting, maybe on your next visit. Rewording things is a real challenge, but imagine just hypothetically there were an artificial intelligence program that could reword it that would not be so it would be better than what humans do. Obviously we're all thinking about ChatGPT and text generation programs, and I'm wondering your final thought.
Yeah.
Are they of use here?
That's a fascinating question, and in my world in writing studies, as you can imagine, this is just blown up in the last 3 months. I think we're hitting a new world here. I think it's particularly interesting to think about in the context of non-native speakers when they're required to rewrite word things or things they have to say, well, that would be an obvious tool to go to get to, right? The problem is the tools don't have any way of establishing veracity, right? You change words, you change meaning. Especially in a scientific context. And also, meaning is derived by the context. So you would have to have a tool that's been basically calibrated for instance, the medical sciences to do that work to generate an appropriate vocabulary. Is that possible? I imagine. I'm just happy that I'm going to retire before I have to do a policy for it.
Dr.
Thanks for the
Moskovitz,
question.
thank you so very much again. You're a repeat offender here, and it's always a privilege. And welcome, and thank you very much for presenting your NSF funded work.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
This is our Dialogue Research Ethics series. We are in our 31st year, and we have been able over 3 decades to have a lot of fun with smart and engaging speakers. Thank you all very much for being here in person and online. See you next month. Our next one, by the way, is next week. On Friday, where Catherine Moss, formerly of UM, now at FIU, is going to talk about her new book about how the Mariel boat lift and a lot of immigration to Miami changed the culture of healthcare in Miami. Look forward to seeing you in exactly 1 week, minus 1 hour. Thank you all very much.
Your comment gave me a good idea, and it may be outside the scope of what